This is the Roller Coaster Podcast, and I'm your host, Lucy Q. Life is a wild ride. It has twists and turns. It's scary, exciting, and downright fun. So throw your head back, arms in the air, and come along with me for the ride.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride.
Do you hear that whisper? That little voice that tugs at your heart, telling you to start living your best life. If that sounds like you, then now is the time to join Nectar Growth. It's the only place online where you can connect with and learn from great coaches with different areas of expertise. Why live another day not believing that you're enough, not seeing all that is possible for you? Why live another day dimming your own light? Nectar is the perfect place for you to discover the real you and uncover who you're meant to be. Life is a journey that we are not meant to walk alone. Nectar gives you a nurturing and supportive community to walk with you on your journey. Start living your best life and see what is truly possible. Come join us at nectargrowth.com. You know you're worth it.
Ride.
Ladies, is the thought of retirement a bit scary? Knowing that you have to have a plan and the financial means in place so that you can continue to live comfortably? Joining me today is Russ Thornton, a retirement advisor to women in their 50s and 60s and host of the podcast Women's Retirement Radio. And he's here to share how retirement isn't as complicated as we think. Welcome to the roller coaster, Russ.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm excited to be here.
So, what has motivated you? What's led you into focusing on helping women, and in particular, women in their 50s and 60s?
A couple of things, actually. I've been a financial advisor for 28 years now. And over that time, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different people in a lot of different situations and stations in life. But what's really stood out to me is when I work with a couple and the husband passes away, and I see the challenges and the overwhelm that the surviving wife has to deal with. Oftentimes, she maybe wasn't the financial lead in the family, and so she's taking on new responsibilities and new challenges, often at the worst possible time when she's dealing with grief. Same thing in a divorce situation, when a woman's world is turned upside down because of divorce, and she's thrust into this new situation with new responsibilities, new challenges. It's challenging work, but it's super, super rewarding. And I really enjoy working with women. I find that, and I've been told that my advice and communication style resonates really well with women. Combine all that with my personal story. So back when I was coming out of college, this has been many years ago, my mom and dad were going through a divorce. And the short version of a long story is my dad had been very successful. My mom had stayed at home and took care of my two younger brothers and I. We had a wonderful family growing up. But when it came to divorce, my mom got a lot of assets and spousal support and child support from my two younger brothers who were still at home at the time. And through a series of some not so great decisions and the apparent lack of any good advice that she got along the way, today she's in a pretty challenging financial position, and it could have been very different. So those are really the two factors I think that have really sparked my passion to connect with, educate, and serve women that are planning for and transitioning into retirement.
And, you know, we've talked about this before in different episodes, that when it comes to women and their financial picture, it seems to be that a lot of women have deferred that to their spouses. And not even understanding even the basics of their mortgage, where their mortgage sits, the debt. And, especially in my age demographic, I still see a lot of women that aren't paying attention to the financial side. How are you overcoming those obstacles with women so that you are engaging them and you are, taking a lot of the fear out of understanding financials?
Well, let me first say, one of the benefits of being in a relationship is you get to share and divide responsibilities. So that's kind of one of the perks. But to your point, it can be dangerous, especially so when it comes to your money. If you go from sharing responsibilities to delegating and then ultimately abdicating and kind of checking out of whether it's finances or other parts of your daily life, I think that's really risky for a lot of obvious and maybe some not so obvious reasons. But I would reinforce the idea that money and personal finance is really simple. Now that does not mean it's easy, but it's really simple at the end of the day. And so the women that I talk to are bright, educated, super smart, super capable. They can do this. They just don't have maybe the familiarity with it because they haven't been dealing with it day to day. They've handed it off to their husband or their partner, and they've just kind of been checked out maybe. And so that lack of familiarity breeds a lack of confidence, and that lack of confidence, I think, further snowballs into a lack of comfort or what can become anxiousness or anxiety. So I would just tell women that are listening, you've got this. I mean, you can handle this. You can do it. There are a plethora of resources online. There's podcasts, like we're doing right now, Lucy, that people can listen into and educate themselves. And the best thing to do is just start. Even if you feel overwhelmed by the thought of tackling your finances, if you haven't been that involved, it all starts with taking a small step. And that can be reading an article, checking a book out of the library, listening to a podcast like The Roller Coaster, or just, availing yourself of the available resources to learn. But I cannot reinforce the idea enough that it really can and should be simple. So don't make it any more complex on yourself than it needs to be.
So for women listening, if they're starting to realize, I don't really know what's going on, what are maybe 3 questions or 3 points that they should learn about, they should find out about their own finances so that, they have a starting point where they can build from?
So 3 great places to start is figuring out what I own. So what assets do I own? And that can be anything from personal property like jewelry or clothes or furniture, to your automobile, to your home if you own a home. It could be investments, it could be your bank accounts, but basically take an inventory and figure out what you own. Next, figure out what you owe. So if you have debt, if it's credit cards, if it's a mortgage, if it's some other kind of loan, student debt, for example, figure out what you owe. And then finally, figure out what your cash flow looks like. So figure out what you have coming in income and figure out what you have going out in expenses. At the end of the day, that's really all financial planning is. It's figuring out what you own, what you owe, and what your cash flow looks like. And are you in a position to build more wealth and plan for the future? Because traditionally retirement is basically just preparing for the time in your life when you're no longer getting a paycheck. And so are you setting yourself on a good path to work towards that? If that's something that's interesting to you. Some people don't ever want to retire, and more power to them. But as far as like 3 good places to start, it's really just taking an inventory and figuring out where you are now, because until you know where you are, it's really hard to figure out where to go next. So start with what you own, what you owe, and figure out what's coming in income and what's going out in expenses.
So then how do you figure out what you need? Because here in Canada, we have, your government retirement fund, whatever you want to call it. It's called CPP, Canadian Pension Plan. And it's really, from what I've heard, it's really not worth a whole lot. You get to pay into it your entire life. But when you sort of retire, what you're getting out of it, it's not enough to live on. And you may own your home, but as long as you're living in your home, it's not providing you with any cash flow. So how do you begin to, or is there a formula to begin to understand, well, what am I going to need?
So I'm always wary of relying on rules of thumb because everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. Hearing you describe the Canadian pension plan sounds very similar to the Social Security system here in the States. And as you described, for many, not all, but for many, Social Security, or it sounds like the Canadian pension plan is not going to cut it as far as, supporting you in retirement. So a good rule of thumb, but again, this is not going to be super appropriate for everyone that's listening, is that first you want to figure out how much does it cost to be you. So figure out what do you spend in an average month, and actually a better way to think of it is what do you spend in an average year. And just to keep the numbers somewhat simple, let's say you spend $50,000 in a year. A good rule of thumb is you want to have about 25 times that amount accumulated in assets by the time you retire. And the thinking behind that is something called the 4% rule. And there's a lot of research and documentation around this that says if you've got a lump sum of capital or assets that you've accumulated and you invest it for the long term, you can sustainably take about 4% income out of that pool of money to support yourself. And given the ups and downs and the vagaries and the surprises of the investment markets, that 4% will still leave enough capital in the portfolio to continue to grow and basically stay up with inflation and things like that. So if you kind of flip that math backwards, 4% is basically the same as 25 times your expenses. So that's, again, not the best, not going to be the best in every situation, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb as far as kind of seeing like, where am I on this path to financial independence?
And when you look at, what it costs to be me for a year, is that you take into consideration if you own your home. And although you own your home, you're still going to have to pay your property taxes. You're still going to have repairs and upgrades made. You sort of work that all into the formula for what it costs to be you in a year.
Yeah, absolutely. So it should be as, and again, I'm never a fan of getting down to the penny, but you should try to get a pretty good picture of an inclusive number that includes all of your expenses, both fixed and regular expenses, as well as budgeting for car repairs, home repairs, just life things that come up along the way. So build a little bit of a cushion in for that. But yeah, the number should be inclusive of everything that it costs to get you through a typical year. Inevitably, there are going to be some surprises and some things you can't see coming down the road. But that's a great place to start. And then you can always, based on your own situation, you can always tweak things, because the 25 times your income or your expenses rule does not include things like Canadian pension or Social Security or other sources of income that you may have coming in. So if you continue to work in a part-time job, or if you have a side hustle where you've got a smaller home-based business, that income is going to help, which is going to reduce the 25 times number. So again, that's just a really rough cut to give you kind of an initial look at if you're on the right path.
A starting point. Yeah. And that's the thing is that, sure, the rules are going to change depending on each individual situation, but I think everybody needs to have a basic starting point to move forward from. Are you finding though that people are, I don't want to say putting off retirement, because traditionally it was set at 60, 65, because I don't even know why they picked that age, because I know a lot of people that continue in their careers into their 70s and into their 80s. But do you find now that women or people in general are, say, putting off that retirement because of they don't have enough money saved?
Yes and no. I see both. I mean, I see clearly if you're in the fortunate position to have been well prepared and saved over your career, and you have a little bit more choice and flexibility about the timing of your retirement, I see many people, exercising that choice and retiring, much sooner. I see people working later because of a couple reasons. A, they need to financially, to your point. So maybe they just don't feel comfortable that they can give up full-time work and the associated paycheck in a normal kind of what's normally associated with a retirement age, whether that's 60 or 65. But I also, and this is always kind of cool to see, but I encounter a lot of people that really enjoy their work and they could afford to retire. They know that they can afford to retire. And I think just that knowledge and the peace of mind that comes with that makes work optional, which is how I often like to refer to as retirement. Instead of calling it retirement, I like to call it work optional. And so if you want to continue to work, hey, go absolutely continue to do that. But knowing that you don't have to, knowing that you can literally tell them to take this job and shove it one day if you so choose, I think it's kind of cool to have that in your back pocket. So, but yeah, to answer your question, Lucy, I do see, I do regularly encounter people that work because they don't feel like they have the option to not work, or they work because they just don't know, because they've never figured out, can I afford to retire? What is retirement going to cost? What am I going to get in, government pension or Social Security or things like that? So a lot of people, I think, do it, continue to work a lot of times just because they don't know if they can afford to retire.
And the face of retirement has changed because, certainly growing up, I saw retirement as you get to a certain age, you stop working and you're sitting in a rocking chair. But, the whole concept around work-life balance has changed, where people are creating their own businesses. Over the past year, there's been an exodus from the traditional working environment because people realized, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to start my own thing. And it then gives them the ability to, people always put things off until retirement. And how many times have you heard people retiring and then they died the next day? So yeah. I think the face of retirement has changed. So it makes, what you need for retirement, it's a little bit more fluid now. And I mean, let's face it, people are living longer.
Much longer. I think the changes around what we traditionally think of around retirement is pretty exciting. And I often tell people that, whether you realize it or not, you've kind of signed up for this deferred life plan where I'm going to work really hard until I get to 60, 62, 65, maybe 70. And then I can afford to really, live it up. That's when it'll be my time. And my counter argument is, well, why not start enjoying your life now? Because to your point, what if you retire and the next day or the next week or the next month you pass away? Or what if you never make it to retirement? Strike a balance between enjoying your life today and each day along the way, while also being prepared for the future. Combine that with the fact that, think back 50, 60, 70 years ago, when there was a lot more manufacturing and manual labor jobs in North America. I think a lot of people retired at 65 and they were worn out. I mean, physically worn out, and the life expectancy was a lot shorter then. Now people are doing less manual labor. People are more, I think, generally considered knowledge workers. So their career takes much less of a physical toll on them. So by the time they do get to 60 or 65, generally speaking, they're in much better shape. Combine that with the fact that people are living longer, healthier lives, and have more mobility and choices and things they can do, whether it's starting a business or going back to school or traveling or whatever the case may be. I think people just have a lot more options, which I think is really cool. It just, I think, really underlines the notion that people need to plan ahead, think about how they want to spend not just their retirement, but the rest of their lives, and be very deliberate and purposeful about that starting now.
Yeah, and when I look at the people in my family, they live till about 90. So I have a good 30 years left to work. That's the way I look at it. I mean, my family, they live a long time. So I'm like, I'm only sort of halfway through my career at this point in time. I still got a long time to go. Russ, do you see women making any common mistakes when it comes to their financial planning?
I see a few. We already talked about one, which is, just kind of sticking their head in the sand when it comes to family finances, especially if they're in a relationship and they just delegate that to their spouse or partner and not being as engaged or involved in the family finances. I think that's risky at best and can be frankly dangerous in the worst case scenarios, whether it's, your spouse passes away or you find yourself going through a divorce or whatever the situation may be. But those circumstances aside, I see a few things. I find women often just, I find they're often very fearful about the future. And as a result, they don't give themselves the permission or the ability to enjoy their financial resources as much as they might otherwise be able to afford to. So I find many women across a lot of age categories, frankly, but as they get older, typically 50s, 60s, 70s and older, they're just very unwilling to spend money that I can often demonstrate they can afford to spend, just because they're worried about, well, what happens if this or what happens if that? I want to make sure that I have enough that I don't outlive my money. And I appreciate the concern. But I think that just, again, goes back to the idea of understanding where you are, where you're going, what you own, what you owe, what your spending and expenses look like, and just striking that balance, making sure that you're always enjoying today while still being prepared for the future. I encounter that a lot. I also encounter often a lot of women feeling that they have to do it themselves. And I'm not saying they need to hire me or hire an advisor, but there can be benefits from getting professional help, whether that's with financial planning or investing or taxes or your estate planning. Just don't feel like you have to, shoulder all of this, burden, this financial burden by yourself. And the final thing I would say is women often naturally just fall into this, I wouldn't even say fall, they naturally step into this caregiver role. So as their parents are aging or they have adult children coming back from college, they want to help, and sometimes they do it at their own expense. And so I often tell women, just like they tell you when you get on a commercial flight, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you help others. So make sure you don't jeopardize your own financial situation, even though you love and want to take care of your family, your friends, and things like that. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
That's great advice. And to your point on getting professional help, it's like anything that we try and approach in life. There's a reason why somebody's a professional. They have an in-depth knowledge about something, and they can probably, cut your learning curve in half, or, they know the little nooks and crannies of understanding planning that as you said, what did you say? You've been in this for 28 years. You have a whole lot more information than I can pick up from one book. So, sure, I can have a basic understanding so that we can have, an intellectual conversation. However, deferring to a professional will always help you get further ahead, whether you're talking about, your tax planning, your estate planning, retirement planning, anything like that, whether you're engaging a professional over a long period of time or just in segments, it makes a huge difference.
I think so too. But let me also say that, and let me reiterate something I mentioned earlier. It really is simple at the end of the day. Like, the work I do is not rocket science. So there are many people that are perfectly capable of handling this on their own if, and these are big ifs, if they have the time and the interest. So a lot of people hire me who are perfectly capable of managing and taking care of all of their financial planning and decisions themselves, but they either don't have the interest or they don't have the time. They'd rather spend time with their family or with their friends, or pursuing things that are important to them, or they just frankly don't have the interest in looking at this thing on a more than once or twice a year basis. So I agree. I think that in many, not all, but in many situations, professional help can absolutely make sense, but I want to be very clear that I don't think that everybody needs to rush out and hire a financial planner or a financial advisor if you have the motivation to handle it yourself.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Russ, as we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, one idea I'll leave with your listeners that I reference a lot. I'm sure everybody listening to this has worked on a jigsaw puzzle at some point in your life. And I often think of your financial life as a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces, whether it's investments or bank accounts or mortgage and debt or your personal property and things like that. And so I often find women are really challenged to figure out, how do I put all these pieces together so they work for me, instead of just creating this anxiety and overwhelm. And so I always encourage people to, much like you would if you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, is first look at the picture on the box. And so if you're a woman and you've got a bunch of financial jigsaw puzzle pieces in your life, take a step back, forget about the money for a second, and spend some time really thinking about your picture on your box. What do you want your life to look like? What do you, where do you want to live? Who do you want to spend your time with? How do you want to spend, let's say it's a random Tuesday in October. Whether you're retired or not, how do you want to spend a random Tuesday in October? So just really take a step back and be very introspective and think about what's important to you, who's important to you, how do you want to spend your time, what gives you energy, and come up with your own very personal picture on your box. And then it will make it much easier to put your financial puzzle pieces together in a way that supports you and aligns with the life you want to live. So that's an idea I'd love to leave with your listeners today.
I really like the idea of a jigsaw puzzle. I use the jigsaw puzzle reference in many things, and it makes a lot of sense to use it in this case as well. Now, Russ, if listeners are wanting to connect with you and learn more about what you do, where's the best place for them to connect with you?
Best place would be go to my website, wealthcareforwomen.com. And as you mentioned earlier, you can also find my podcast, which is Women's Retirement Radio. And I'm, on social media and things like that. But probably the best place is to visit my website.
If you're looking to connect with Russ, make sure you check out the show notes. I will have all of the links in there. And Russ, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lucy. This has been a lot of fun, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Roller Coaster Podcast. Want to chat or share your ideas about today's show? Pop me an email at hello@therollercoasterpodcast.com. Don't forget to connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at The Roller Coaster Podcast. Our theme song, Roller Coaster, was performed by The Lucky Setback. Audio editing by the one and only Jeff Quigley of Quigley Creative.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby.